It's good to be part of this discussion. I'm Patrick Krill. Just a quick thumbnail background, my professional bio. I am an attorney. I'm licensed to practice law in California, not Minnesota. I've been living in Minnesota for the last 11 years, however. I moved here to become a licensed alcohol and drug counselor and I got my graduate degree at the Hazel and Betty Ford School of Addiction Studies. And then I remained in Minnesota to work as an addiction counselor, ultimately becoming the director of the legal professionals program at Hazardous. So that's sort of my background as a former practicing attorney, a clinician treating substance use disorders in a residential setting. For the last 5 years, I've been working as an advisor to primarily large law firms and corporate legal departments in the realm of mental health and well-being. So that's who I am. I'm also a researcher, obviously, and I'll be talking to you about some of the research that I've recently had published that gives us some, I think, really useful insight into the challenges we face as a population.
Thanks. Welcome, Patrick. Joan.
Thanks, Mike, and hi, everybody. Glad to be here. I've been the director at Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers for the last 16 years. Just past that milestone, it amazes me. And within that realm, of course, we assist people who come to us for help. And we're also part of trying to support efforts to increase well-being in our profession. And we're also very engaged in the conversation about how there's a really critical connection between well-being and diversity, equity, and inclusion, because you can't have one without the other. And so we've been really glad to join with the Bar Association and others in the last year on really raising the volume of those conversations.
Welcome, Joan. Thanks for those intros. I thought I might begin with just a little background information about these studies. Both, Joan, your recent research had to do with judicial stressors, and Patrick, I think one of your more recent projects had to do with the disproportionate effect that certain stressors have on women in the profession. So it's sort of interesting to see this work being a little bit more diversified and looking at specific populations. Joan, I wonder if you might start by just telling us a little bit, because I know both of you were involved talking about the Hazleton project. Is that correct? Were both of you involved in that project? I forget the history of that initial study. That was what, 2 years ago now?
That study was released in 2016, and Patrick really did the heavy lifting on that one, along with a colleague from the State Bar of Wisconsin who was running their lawyer assistance program. And I was just someone who was part of the Commission on Lawyer Assistance Programs at the time and waving a flag to get this done. And that study resulted in a report called The Path to Lawyer Wellbeing, Practical Recommendations for Positive Change, which had recommendations for a number of groups of stakeholders, including judges. And the recommendations for judges was that there should be a separate survey. And so that's what was done and resulted in this article.
Got it. Thanks for the right. 2016, man. I can't believe it was that long ago.
I know.
Yeah, and that was the first national study of the prevalence of substance use disorders and mental health problems in the legal profession. And it really did, as Joan said, sort of kickstart a broader conversation within the profession. And it's really gotten us, I think, to a meaningfully different and better place in terms of awareness and buy-in across the profession that these are challenges. That was, that study gave us, I think, a really useful baseline on the prevalence of the problems nationally. But it didn't provide the opportunity to dig into the cause, right? The root causes and some of the risk factors and predictors. And we could talk about, we all sort of understand some of the things that drive mental health problems in the profession, but we didn't have data, which was why I thought it was imperative to conduct this recent research that I'm sure I'll talk about in a few minutes, which went beyond prevalence to really try to isolate some of the predictors of the problems.
So yeah, let's jump into some of that. Maybe before we do, though, just a quick overview of what might have been surprising about my memory of the 2016 results is that lawyers are are in rough shape, very basically, that we disproportionately are impacted by these stressors, that we're more likely to be have substance abuse problems, report mental health issues. Maybe Patrick, you can just quickly summarize some of the surprising findings of the 2016 study.
Yeah, so I think that's accurate to say that the picture that was painted by those data it was not necessarily encouraging. Obviously, we've understood as a profession that lawyers experience high levels of distress. It's why, for example, there have been lawyer assistance programs doing this work for a long time, because there has been a recognition that there was a need, but we didn't have data. One of the most surprising findings to us at the time was how much more younger lawyers were appearing to struggle, right? Which I think suggests, maybe an increased role for law schools and better preparing law students, just more synergy between the profession and the practice and law schools to try and get law students to a better place. But it was really, I think that the younger lawyers were experiencing more distress. That was surprising. But the picture that emerged was one that suggested we needed to redouble our efforts, right? We determined through that research that stigma and fear of consequences was one of the primary barriers to seeking help. And that certainly has informed efforts over the last 5 years to try and reduce stigma. It's why you see a lot more people, frankly, stepping forward and sharing their story and being willing to offer testimonials, because that data really showed that was the number one barrier to seeking help was people had fear of, what is this disclosure going to do to me? And, is it somehow going to jeopardize things that I've worked so hard for?
I would agree with that. I think the numbers regarding depression, anxiety, substance use were fairly consistent with earlier state-by-state studies, but the difference in newer lawyers. So I know that our program and others have worked really hard to try and talk about that. And one of the things that has come out of it, though, is I will sometimes have someone say to me, well, it's because we're willing to tell the truth. We're willing, in our age group or as newer lawyers, we are less afraid to say, yeah, I had depression and I got help. What's the problem? So maybe that's a positive side of it. The other thing that we found that I think people in my line of work found surprising and triggering a need to really do more education was the suicide, the percentage of people who had thought about suicide, and that was almost 10%. And it's something that tells us that actually it was a little over 10%. Have you thought about suicide? I can't remember if that was the exact question, Patrick, but it means that we need a lot more, it's not just about, I'm going to do some things for my well-being, but it's people are struggling to the point where suicide seems like a reasonable option. So there's some very, very serious issues here, and we have to be looking at the whole spectrum.
Yeah, that's a great point, Joan. And we were asking specifically about, have you considered suicide during your legal career, right? And so it was isolating, sort of taking out of the equation people who may have had those struggles prior to coming into the profession. And so it was, I think, 11.5% of respondents said yes, which was certainly an alarming number.
Was that equal among age groups as well? Or was it just more among the young attorneys?
That I don't recall off the top of my head, but younger attorneys were experiencing higher levels of depression, anxiety, and hazardous drinking. So I would hazard a guess that yes, probably, because all of those things can be risk factors for suicidal ideation.
And Joan, I think your study on the topic of thoughts of suicide, I think your study showed a similar finding among the judiciary as well. Isn't that right?
The numbers for the judiciary were lower, and yet they were still concerning. So 2% of the judges said that they had considered suicide. So that's much lower than the number of lawyers. And you can attribute that to a number of factors. This has also been studied by a group in Australia, and they made some suggestions as well, which was that the fact that you had reached becoming a judge is something that people strive for as a positive goal. And so reaching that goal, you're still feeling that 1 in 50 are actively, said, yes, I have thought about suicide. That's a concern. The numbers on substance use and depression, while they were lower than for the lawyers, they were higher than average.
So not the same as the general population, I guess,
Correct.
among judges.
Correct.
Got it. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the more recent studies. Maybe Joan, you can tell us first about why you decided to review the judiciary.
Well, I've been part of a group for a while that has been looking at judicial well-being, and we offer some programs. I was pleased to be part of this committee to put together, follow the recommendation from the well-being report. And we have a rock star in Minnesota, Dr. David Swenson, who's an industrial psychologist up at the University of St. Scholastica, who really has been taking a look at judicial trauma and stress. And he agreed to be our lead researcher on this. He had worked with Judge Sean Flerkey, who has recently left the judiciary to move to take over a foundation up in the Northland. And so they've been working together for a while, and we started working together. And we had a survey instrument that we were trying to find a place for. And so we found a place for it with the ABA effort. And questions had to do with what causes stress, what is the effect, and then also questions about the sorts of level of drinking, indications of depression, but also what helps. We spent a lot of time on what helps you build resiliency. And one of the findings was that there was a significant disconnect between these are the things I think are important and this is what I'm actually doing. And so that is the sweet spot for education, for reducing stigma, for bringing people together to whether it's conversations with colleagues, which have been shown to be a very helpful way to reduce the impact of trauma, because remember the level of trauma that's being experienced, to things that are more personal, like exercise and things like that. And so that's where a lot of the effort is going in trying to take this information and do education and provide a context in which it's helpful.
Joan, could I ask a question about that, about the findings specifically? So do you mean that there was kind of a misalignment between people's behaviors and their values around well-being? Would that be accurate?
I think that is something that you could have a conversation about. The difference was more, yes, I think this is important. Am I doing it? Well, not so much. And so, for example, asking for peer support. 83% said this would be a really good thing to do. And 36% are actually doing it.
Right.
Personally support colleagues. 90% say that's really important. 55% are doing it. So those are the, and then there were also questions about the personal kinds of things like meditation, mindfulness practices. 81% thought it would be a really good idea. 36% are doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, Joan, because you had mentioned, kind of discussing with colleagues in general, and that being a positive thing that could be done to help alleviate some of the stress. Are we talking about having those discussions about, listen, you just gave me 3 more assignments. I'm already booked up with 7 assignments. This is causing me a lot of stress. Or are you talking about the other side of things where it's I'm dealing with a lot of stress. There's a lot of stuff going on in my life. I feel stressed because of this and this, and it's affecting my well-being. Are you talking about kind of a discussion about the individual's mental health, or a discussion about the stress? Is there a difference?
Mhm.
I don't know.
I love that question, Landon, because it's about being supportive to each other, and saying, this is how I do my best work, and this is the impact it's having on me, versus kind of asking for what you need and saying to someone who might be more in a supervisory capacity, that this is something that's going to be important for me in being able to succeed in this organization. I think they're very closely aligned conversations, but they have different ways of, your head is in a different place when you're thinking about asking someone who has some control over your work versus sharing, and more of a collaboration.
I was wondering, Patrick, I think defined it as a sort of a disjunct between values and behavior. But to Landon's question, I wonder to what extent it's just a systemic problem. Are there avenues that are just not available, say, to the judiciary that might be open to the general public? Say, for example, peer support. What kind of community do judges have that is safe for them to raise these issues, or are there broader issues that sort of blocking that kind of thing from happening, or is it more of a values-based problem?
Well, isolation is a huge problem in the judiciary because you have your chambers. So it can be difficult, especially when you don't have someone down the hall, to be able to connect with others. And that's one of the things that we're encouraging, is finding ways to do that. There's a concept called a Judicial Roundtable, and this can work in so many different places, which is where a group of judges is brought together to talk about, usually there's a type of agenda, there's a few ground rules, and it's to share something that has an impact in a way that people can acknowledge it. And sometimes there's some opportunity to give each other some feedback, things like that. There's a lot of ranges of things like that are happening. But isolation for judges has long been recognized as a challenge. And the saying is that once you put on a black robe, you no longer know if your jokes are funny. And especially in smaller towns, suddenly you're the judge, but then suddenly you're the judge's kid. And so it's kind of like being the preacher's kid. That can create even more isolation within the community. And so by recognizing that this is a challenge, then we can start to say, all right, what do we do about this? How do we create opportunities for more connection and collaboration?
And Joan, you kind of touched on something there with judge's kid. One of the questions that came in was asking, in regards to these studies that have occurred, are any of them looking at ancillary positions such as the paralegals, legal secretaries, and perhaps, the kids, the family, and the stressors there? Or are these all focused on specifically the judges and specifically the lawyers?
So to my knowledge, I think all of the research has either been on judges, lawyers, or law students. I'm not aware of surveys. It's possible that the Association of Administrators, ALA, maybe they've done a survey of ancillary positions or staff members. Joan, are you aware of any?
I'm not aware of one by them, but your colleague in the ABA Hazelden study, Linda Albert, did a survey of public defenders in the state of Wisconsin. And the article that was published in the Wisconsin Bar Magazine following it was called "The Toll of Trauma." They used support staff as a control group. But what they found was that for support staff, the rate of symptoms of depression, PTSD type symptoms, and other things that they measured was higher than the general population, but lower than the lawyers. And so that's the only study I know of. But what I can tell you is that, at least for our lawyer assistance program, we are saying that if we do a CLE in a law firm, we want the entire staff to attend.
Yep.
If whatever it is we're doing, we want the staff involved too, because they're in the same soup. But I'm not aware of anybody taking on a survey like that. It would be an interesting thing, I think, to have happen.
And that's the same philosophy that I operate under generally, unless it's a presentation or a training that is specifically targeted to the needs of a group at a particular phase, right? New associates or something like that. I think having an inclusive conversation and providing inclusive education really is key, because even though we don't have the data, there's limited data on the mental health of support staff and those kind of working in the profession who are not lawyers. It would defy logic to think that they are, enjoying robust mental health while working alongside people who are struggling under a lot of the same pressures. I mean, as Joan said, they're kind of in the same soup, and they're exposed to a lot of the same risk factors, maybe not to the exact same degree, but still a lot of that is swimming around. So I think making any sort of educational content available to everybody is always best practice.
Sort of saving this question until later in our program, but are there communities within the profession, or are there other dissections that should be taking place? We've talked about sort of paraprofessionals, the professionals, the judiciary, but should we be taking a look at, mid-career professionals? What's sort of based on your existing studies, what would be the next path, do you think?
Well, Patrick, this is a softball, right? Because you have got so much data and one small article.
Right. Yeah, I think that so the study that I just had published on May 12th, which we could talk about, examined gender specific differences. But I do think there are meaningful differences at sort of career stage, right? Younger attorneys have different stressors, different stress levels than mid-level associates, or and then senior attorneys are in a different boat altogether. So we don't necessarily have a lot of published research on those specific, career stage differences, but I do think it'll be important to look at. The study that was just published on May 12th, and Joan, thank you. It looks like Joan just circulated the link to the article, published in PLOS One. It's the Public Library of Science, their multidisciplinary journal. It was published open access, meaning that is not behind a paywall. Anybody can access it, download it, share it, reproduce it. You don't need any permissions, and I would encourage you to do that. This was a large study that I undertook with a colleague from the University of Minnesota Medical School. We worked with the California Lawyers Association and the DC Bar to survey their attorneys. And we initially planned on launching this research in March of last year, right? So we got the green light to do it in late 2019. We developed the survey, got the Institutional Review Board approval. We were all set to go. And then both California and DC were going into lockdown, right? So we knew that we had to pull back on disseminating that survey, but it ended up being a blessing in disguise, because what we did was we had the opportunity to modify the assessments, ask some different questions. And then ultimately we administered this survey last summer, like through June, July, August of 2020. And we were able to capture and look at the way that lawyers were responding to the heightened stress associated with COVID-19. So I think at the end of the day, our data ended up being more instructive because it was occurring during this, unprecedented crisis. If you'd like, I could just sort of tell you some of the high level findings that came out of it.
I do want you to do that. Thank you.
I should say at the outset, we were not intending to conduct a study on gender differences in the legal profession. It was a long survey, and I'm very appreciative of so many people taking it for that reason. But we just kind of wanted to get a lot of data and then look and see what it was telling us. And the very clear through line that emerged, and so we knew that this should be the first sort of story that we told, was that women were experiencing meaningfully worse mental health. They just were in a different boat across the board. So we had about 3,400 licensed, currently practicing attorneys included in this final sample. It was a random sample. For those of you who are sort of statistically minded, that's valuable for being able to say that your results are generalizable to a broader population. So it was a big data set, random sample. Women have higher levels of depression, anxiety, hazardous drinking, higher levels of stress, and they're more likely to leave the profession or contemplate leaving the profession due specifically to mental health burnout or stress, right? There are a lot of reasons why people leave the profession, women and men included. We isolated, are you thinking about leaving specifically due to mental health burnout or stress? And 25% of women said yes. The number was, from my perspective, unacceptably high for men as well. It was 17%. But there was just a gender disparity there. Roughly half of lawyers were screening positive for symptoms of depression and anxiety. 30% of that was in sort of the mild range, which is not necessarily clinically significant. I mean, nobody wants to be experiencing mild depression or anxiety, but that wouldn't necessarily warrant any kind of clinical intervention or treatment. 20% were experiencing moderate to severe depression and anxiety that would warrant some sort of treatment or intervention. A lot of risky and hazardous drinking, really high levels of risky drinking and high levels of hazardous drinking, which is disordered drinking, right? Someone's screening positive for probably or quite possibly having an alcohol use disorder. And again, women were, the levels were significantly higher. That's probably worth us maybe talking about and trying to understand why that is. But all of this really points to, I think, the need for increased awareness, education, specifically around the drinking piece. And that's a point that we made in the paper because there's a lot of really valuable research on the ability of education to reduce problem drinking behaviors in a variety of populations. Sometimes people just don't appreciate their risk, right? And they don't really understand the consequences of their current level of consumption. But back to the overall headline that came out of this, it was the gender disparities. Women are more stressed. They have higher levels of work overcommitment, higher levels of work-family conflict. And that was the predictor. That was the number one predictor of whether women would leave the profession due to mental health burnout or stress. Are they experiencing high levels of work-family conflict? And if they are, they're 4.5 times more likely to leave the profession due to mental health. And so that, I think, points the way to, that shows us that we need to work on trying to resolve that tension. And from my perspective, I don't think a career in the law should be a choice between having a career in the law and having a family. And it would appear that for too many people, that feels like an untenable position, and it's too much of a choice. The final point that I'll make, going back to the drinking and how we were able to kind of capture how lawyers responded to the stress associated with COVID-19. Another point that we make in the article is that it's clear that lawyers need more tools in their tool bag to manage stress and anxiety and sort of all the things that have been swirling around for the last 1.5 years, because about 30 to 40%, depending on the specific group, increased their alcohol consumption in response to the stress associated with COVID-19. But it wasn't just that they were drinking maybe one more drink a week. Women who were drinking more in response to COVID were 7 times more likely to be doing so in a risky way. Men who were drinking more were 4 or 5 times more likely to be drinking in a risky way. So what was clear was that some very pronounced maladaptive behaviors emerged as coping mechanisms for the stress associated with COVID-19. And, for some of those people, I mean, they're going to end up with alcohol use problems long-term. And Joan, I mean, these might be people that you see in the future that, the problem really took hold during the pandemic, right? Because I think our data makes clear that a lot of seeds were planted during the last year for ongoing stress and dysfunction. I think time will tell what that looks like and how that all shakes out. But that's sort of a high-level review of what we found. We're going to be publishing probably 2 more papers on this data because there was so much. And the first paper was just about the gender disparities. But there will be probably 2 more papers out in the next, I would say, 8 to 12 months, summarizing what we found here.
And I just want to note, we've had a few people chime in on chat just to the panelists, but I want to recognize that and note that there are several people out there saying this it helps to reach out. Make sure you're reaching out. Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers, AA 12-step programs, sharing with colleagues. I don't want to go through and name any names, of course, but going through, we're getting chats from different people saying that this is a serious thing that they were able to address, and they found programs such as 12-step AA programs and Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers very much beneficial, and encourage anybody that's dealing with this to reach out. We did have one question asking for definitions. Sarah Sosi-Iberg, of course, our regular attendee, asked, how are risky and hazardous defined for the purposes of the study? Could you go through and clarify that a little bit?
Sure. So risky and hazardous drinking are essentially sort of diagnostic categorizations or categories of someone's risk level associated with their alcohol. So at a very high level, risky drinking is drinking more than the generally prescribed safe guidelines. So that would be more than 2 drinks a day or 14 drinks a week for a man, more than 1 drink a day or 7 drinks a week for females. Men and women metabolize alcohol differently, right? And those are generally the widely stated safe guidelines. If you're drinking under that, if you're drinking more than that, it's considered risky drinking, meaning that you are at an increased risk of physical health consequences, social consequences, and mental health consequences. It's not that hard to be a risky drinker, right? And just kind of in our society, and alcohol consumption is a big piece of life. So that's not necessarily a hard bar to clear. Hazardous drinking is something that we really do need to be very mindful of, because at that point you are engaging in a level of alcohol consumption. So that would be more than 21 drinks a week for men and more than 14 a week for women, generally speaking. And at that level, you are actively, it's an active ongoing hazard in your life for your physical health, for your mental health. Certainly, there's a lot of co-occurrence of mental health problems and substance use in the legal profession. Frequently, people don't recognize that their mental health is being really undermined by their lifestyle. And so, hazardous drinking that's something that we really do need to be paying attention to. And it was, roughly 30, I don't want to misstate it, but almost 40% of female attorneys are engaging in hazardous drinking. So that's something we really do have to take note of.
It seems to me that there's a big gap between risky and hazardous. I'm surprised that there aren't, I think lawyers love to subdivide and organize and break everything out. I'm surprised there's not more steps and more red flags and more within that there's such a big gap between risky and hazardous. Is there the studies and the information, are you looking at things that start getting close to hazardous, or?
Well, I think it's important to avoid too much granularity around that, because different people are different, right? And so what we used were screening instruments that are sort of well validated for categorizing someone's alcohol consumption into general categories. But within that, you could have 2 people who would seem outwardly similarly situated, and they're drinking the same number of drinks per week, and it may qualify as risky or hazardous drinking. And for one person, it is really derailing their life, and the consequences are significant. For someone else, it's maybe not as much of a problem. The physical health risk is there, but it's not causing any problems in their life. And so that's why it's hard to, and why I try to avoid putting a precise number on, putting too much emphasis on number of drinks, because it's also, there's this sort of subjective component of how is it impacting you? What is that doing in your life, and what does that look like in terms of your overall functionality. I hope that makes sense. I don't know if it does.
It does. Thanks, Pat.
I remember reading recently that there is some talk about changing that 14 versus 7 to a recommendation that it should be 7 for everyone.
Right, exactly. And the other point, because we recognize now there's a lot more research into the fact that alcohol consumption puts us at increased risk for a variety of health problems that maybe we didn't understand previously. The other point to make, it's less relevant when or maybe it's just as relevant when we're drinking at home, but if you're out at a bar or a restaurant, right, or whatever, when is the last time you saw a server measuring precisely? And all of those drinking guidelines of what's healthy and safe are based on very precise volume measurements. And we almost always get more than that in a serving at a bar or a restaurant or something like that. And so people are inadvertently and unknowingly drinking sometimes at risky levels, and they think that they're drinking within healthy levels, at healthy levels.
Maybe a silly question on the drinking piece. Is it fair to assume that it's stress that's causing the drinking? I've read that most of us have gained about 2 pounds a month as a result of the pandemic because of our proximity to the kitchen as we're working from home. How do we know that it's stress that's the trigger for increased drinking?
Well, based on our research, it wasn't necessarily. And so COVID, the sort of everything associated with COVID did seem to be increasing, alcohol consumption, but it wasn't work over commitment. One of the measures that we looked at was work over commitment and what the relationship was between someone's mental health and their substance use and their level of work over commitment. And that was a factor, but the number that basically the thing that influenced drinking in sort of the number 2 spot was workplace permissiveness towards alcohol, right? So culture, right? That sort of social pressure or social influences, which we understand in the general population. We've always understood that social influences can amount to a risk factor for someone's substance use. But in the legal profession, it's clear that workplace attitudes towards drinking influence the likelihood that someone will be a hazardous drinker. And so that suggests us a need for us to just be a little bit more intentional about that and to be a little bit more aware of, kind of the cultural component within the profession, because we've understood that sort of on an anecdotal level. It's one of the reasons why the pledge campaign calls for legal employers to try to reduce the expectation of alcohol in the profession. This was the first study that actually put data to that question and showed the relationship between workplace permissiveness. And that was an assessment we used. It's called Your Workplace. And it asks questions like, how frequently do you go drinking with your colleagues? How much is alcohol a part of the sort of environment? And there's a real relationship there between a high workplace permissiveness or embrace of alcohol and someone's risk level.
That must have been. Go ahead, Joan.
I would add to that, it's not just the employer. That may be the research, where the research is, but we have opportunities to think about the culture for professional organizations. And one of the things I saw in probably the 2 years before the pandemic, and like Landon, I attend lots of events, and we promoted this. We said, we're not going to tell you to not serve alcohol, but instead of making people stand in line to get a soft drink, why not have a water station that is situated somewhere away from the bar so that people can very quietly not use any alcohol and not have to talk about it. And that anybody who doesn't want a second drink, because, I waited in line this long, I might as well have another one, that they could just go get a glass of water. And so what was found was that not only did the water jugs empty very, very quickly, because a lot of people were just thirsty from talking so much, but the people in recovery could be quiet about it if they chose to, and they felt so much more comfortable at these events. And the amount consumed overall, now maybe the food and beverage minimum folks didn't like this, but the amount of alcohol consumed overall went down precipitously. And so these are the kinds of things that can be done in law firms, in companies. I was at one event, which one of the things they had, like they had one area where you could help yourself to a glass of wine, and then they had a whole nother area, which was a cooler full of designer sodas. And there was a lot of wine left and very few designer sodas. So it's not so much that what people should do or that you have to take it away, but it's if you provide alternatives, a lot of people are going to engage in more healthy behavior. Now, if there is a person who has an alcohol use disorder and who is present at one of these events and they can go get alcohol, none of that is going to make a difference if they are a person who is struggling and who is going to want to have as much alcohol as they can get. That's what substance use disorder looks like, as well as other things. But these are the kinds of things organizations can do. You know, let's all buy stock in designer sodas, because when we come back to work, I think we're going to have a lot more of that going on.
Those are great tips. Thanks, Joan. There are a number of questions in chat as well. You may have seen the side conversation here about practice area impact. I was wondering about that earlier as well. I had also heard that family law practitioners burn out at a faster rate than other practice areas. I thought there was actual reason. I thought there was actual studies on that, but you say you're not aware of a sort of a practice area breakdown.
So our study, we didn't publish that. We did look at not necessarily practice area, but sort of work setting.
Yeah.
And we looked at sort of, you know, firm versus corporate legal department versus government, you know, solo practitioner, et cetera. And at least in this data, this California DC data from last year, there was, I would say, surprising uniformity throughout work environments. It does appear that lawyers working in large, sort of really large firms have higher levels of mental health struggles. But it is not sort of, you know, that they're in a completely different league. The one thing that surprised me, because it's counter to, I think, a narrative that's out there, is that in-house lawyers had very high levels of stress, on par with just slightly below their law firm peers. And so I think a lot of people tend to view going in-house as maybe an escape hatch, right? I can go work in that environment. It's going to be less stressful than this law firm that I'm in. And it didn't appear that that was really true. I mean, it may be slightly less stressful, but, you know, there's just not as much of a discrepancy as I expected going into it.
Anecdotally, I would share that. It's kind of fun sometimes to go talk to a group of solo practitioners and say, okay, according to this study, you are better off than the people at the big law firm. So, you know, you're doing some things right. Let's talk about what more you can do right. Anecdotally, as I put in the chat, you know, there's one area, and it's a smaller group of practitioners, but per capita, IP lawyers is something that we see, intellectual property. And I think that may be because people with a science or engineering background are perhaps not expecting the level of stress there can be. And there have been a couple of articles written about the particular sources of stress for people in that area. And when we go out and talk to, for example, a bar section, so if any of you are with a bar section and you want to bring us in, we can survey your members and get a sense of what are the areas that are most stressful in this practice, and then present that as part of what we talk about in the program. It's not anywhere near the level of Patrick's survey. It's Survey Monkey. We don't go to an institutional review board, but it gives rise to good discussion.
And I've observed that as well, that lawyers working in IP or life sciences, kind of that realm, they appear to just be struggling more.
That's interesting. It makes me wonder if the statutory regime is responsible for the stress in some respects, or the litigation environment, or whatever. But trying to protect your client's IP is under the current structure, and the expectations that businesses have are all part of the process. That the cultural change is partially statutory. I wonder if seems deeper than. I want to go back, shift a little bit to the work-family conflict portion of your study, Patrick. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I guess it's no surprise that might impact women more than it does men. But can you talk about how you define the work-family conflict and what the findings were on that part of your study?
Yeah, so we actually, all of the things that we measured, we used sort of existing assessments. So there was I believe a 4-question assessment. I'll have the specific questions in front of me, but that sort of got at work-family conflict. So these were validated instruments that have been used in other populations to identify, basically to produce a score, right? And so does someone have a low score, a moderate score, or a high score on all of the things that we measured? And women had higher scores. They scored higher on the assessment measuring work-family conflict. And what was I think, I should say, men had high levels of work-family conflict as well. And that's an important point here. I don't want to be painting the picture that men in the legal profession are, enjoying great mental health or these conflict-free lives. Men had high levels of work-family conflict as well. It was simply less high than women. With women, it had a much more direct bearing on whether they were going to think about leaving due to mental health, burnout, or stress. And so for some reason, and the data doesn't really explain this, men, it seemed to be impacting their thoughts about leaving less. They're experiencing the conflict, but it isn't necessarily leading them to think about leaving due to mental health, burnout, or stress the same way that it is women. Just another point there, we looked at something called perceived possibility of promotion, which is how likely do you think it is that there is a promotion in your future, right? Maybe that means advancing through your firm or just getting a better opportunity. Men scored higher on that assessment, meaning they perceived greater opportunity for promotion than women. And that was a protective factor for their mental health. It seemed to reduce stress. And so maybe there's some interplay there between work-family high levels of work-family conflict, low perceived possibility of promotion that could tip the scales for female attorneys, right? I have this work-family conflict. I don't see a lot of opportunity ahead of me. This maybe isn't what I want to do. Men have some work-family conflict, higher level of perceived possibility of promotion. And so therefore, they're more likely to sort of stick with it and to remain in the profession.
So I'm curious because we've kind of talked about a variety of different risk factors and things like that. And I know when it comes to alcohol, I suspect it's biological is the reason there's a difference between men and women. But are there other risk factors that you guys looked at that are different for different groups, such as, for alcohol, there was a different risk level for males versus females. Are there other differences or other risk factors that might be different based on demographics?
The risk factors were largely the same. It was just a matter of the odds ratio that emerged. So how much of an impact that risk factor had, right? So for example, work-family conflict was more predictive of women leaving the profession due to mental health, burnout, or stress than men. Work over commitment was more predictive of whether men would leave compared to women. But both of these things were risk factors for both of them. So it was just sort of where those things ranked, if that makes sense, right? So say overall, 10 same risk factors, but just the ranking, the order of those risk factors and their impact on men versus women was different. And that raises an important point that I don't want to get lost in this. I'm talking about women having higher levels of mental health distress and hazardous drinking, more likely to leave. I wouldn't want this to be heard as the problem is with women, right? Like they can't cut it, or that, it's somehow that they're not committed or they're not up to the task. That is not what we're saying with this research. I think that it's really pointing more towards the systems that are in place that are producing these, disparate environments or disparate impacts. Men are more likely to leave as a result of work over commitment and stress than women, right? So women can actually, it would appear based on our data, sort of withstand or endure more stress and higher levels of work over commitment, and that's not going to have a bearing on whether they leave due to mental health, burnout, or stress. It's that work-family conflict that is tipping the scales, really clearly in our data. Whereas work over commitment and perceived stress, that does have a really clear bearing on men's intentions of leaving.
And kind of to that, I'm curious. I have a two-part question. I'm going to try to break down here. A lot of the studies and a lot of the problems that we've been realizing with our methodology is that our default person tends to be the white male. And I think science as a whole is starting to get better, and our research and things like that. I mean, we're starting to realize different demographics may need to be approached differently, or we may need to do different research or different ways of targeting. I'm wondering partially if that plays a role, or if that was something you guys were aware of when kind of going through this data, if there was a different way to approach it to try to make sure that you're not setting something up as a default. This is a great study for our default white male versus any other demographic.
Right. I think that's a really important point. This was a random sample. So we sent the survey to a randomly selected list of members of the California Lawyers Association and the DC Bar. And, we got back what we got back, which tended to be predominantly, although the breakdown was actually about 50-50 men and women. So that's inconsistent with the actual existing population. So women were overrepresented in our sample. Men, the white male thing, I think the demographics that we got back pretty much looked like the profession. So which means that white men were certainly more represented than other groups. But I think if you wanted to oversample from a particular group to sort of offset some of those disparities that I think you're talking about, it wouldn't truly be a random sample, but maybe that is an important way to approach the research in the future. I don't know, Joan, if you have similar thoughts or.
Well, in the judicial survey, we did not, for the initial article, we did not break it out other than by gender, but we did have 15.5% identify themselves as non-Caucasian. So that's a big enough group to pull out some data. And so that's what we're doing next, is to look at that. Plus there's conversations about doing a national survey just of judges of color to then compare that. And I don't know where that's going to go, because that's happening in a different place than I have anything to say about, but we're encouraging it. And so I think that being able to do some of these comparisons is going to be important. I just want to mention something that I think is kind of related to what Patrick was saying about, we don't want this to be a survey that says that women can't do things or should, that it's more of a challenge. And I would compare that with the newer lawyer data that's in the 2016 study. Okay, fine, there's greater issues, greater incidence of substance use, et cetera, with newer lawyers. Well, let's not have any new lawyers. You wouldn't say that. And so I think we have to compare these things and say what we have identified are things that help people to succeed. And there's a rule on diligence that we all know that we have to abide by, and there's a comment to it that says a lawyer's workload must be controlled so that each matter can be handled competently. Here's your little ethics flash for CLE credit. And the point is that that is about how do we do our best work, and how do we support people in being able to do their best work, and or at minimum competently.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Joan. That was actually a point that we make in the article, that, you know, I think the stress levels, the levels of work over commitment, the levels of mental health distress that our data revealed suggest that maybe we need to look at, are there more safeguards warranted, right? Because what is the impact on chronic stress? Clearly has an impact on cognitive functioning, which can impact competence. I mean, all of these things are related. And so I think we need to, as a profession, look at the levels of stress and overcommitment that lawyers are experiencing and ask, is that really setting them up to be able to practice effectively and competently? And do we need to maybe incorporate some more safeguards? All these points I am making now are made in the sort of discussion and conclusion section of that research paper, which is pretty easy to skim. I would encourage people to read at least the intro, the discussion, and conclusion. The results is a little, you know, stats heavy, but the narrative piece is very accessible.
I
Folks,
have posted a lot of things in the chat. What I can't post is an actual attachment. So Mike, I just emailed you the original 2016 article. If that's something you can post in the chat. If not, it's easily findable.
yeah, that's great. Thanks, Joan. I will post that and the other resources, links to both the studies in the show notes in the Practice Law Library. So we're recording this session. It'll be in the Practice Law Library in the CLE folder near the bottom of the directory. So you'll be able to watch it there, as well as access all of the materials that we've discussed today. We are at the top of the hour. I need to cut us off, I'm afraid. Before I do that, I just want to call out Abby Ward, who's a member of our member services team. She's agreed to let me reference her here because she's participating on the call, and her team is responsible for producing these CLE events. So she's allowed me to drop in her email here. Abby Ward at minbars.org. A lot of great comments in chat and in the Q&A, and just I see coming into me personally about different options for serving alcohol, similar to the tips that Joan has provided, or just offering an option not to serve alcohol. So that's feedback that you're certainly welcome to send to the Bar Association, but Abby is right on that team and has direct impact on those kinds of decisions. So you should feel free to send her friendly email recommendation and feedback on that topic. So certainly feel free to do that. Send that message to Abby. All great tips and important information. 2 weeks from now, we'll be back with a conversation about the new post-pandemic workspaces, hoteling options, smaller law firm office footprints, all those kinds of things with experts in the commercial real estate world, who we were kindly bashing earlier in the program. So hopefully they will still be happy to join us. And thanks to Clio for their support of this program. Joan, Patrick, thank you so much. It was a great conversation. Thanks to all those attending for your great comments. We'll be very happy to have you guys back at any time. And in the meantime, you guys have a great rest of your week.